Herzlich willkommen bei der Jungen Freiheit. Wir haben heute einen ganz besonderen Gast da. Es ist Matt Boyle, der ist Washington-Korrespondent für Breitbart News und ganz nah an Donald Trump dran. Er interviewt ihn regelmäßig und wahrscheinlich so oft wie kein anderer Journalist. Er ist regelmäßig im Oval Office und auch bei den Presseerklärungen im Weißen Haus.
I would argue we are the best read publication in the Trump White House.
Er ist heute exklusiv bei uns für die Junge Freiheit da. Maybe you can help us out to interview Trump one day.
Maybe.
Yes.
Maybe. Good luck.
Ab jetzt wird das Interview in Englisch sein. Ihr könnt es aber gerne in einer synchronisierten Version auf Deutsch auf unserem Kanal sehen. Der Link ist unten. Und wenn ihr weiterhin so eine Arbeit unterstützen wollt, die wir hier machen, bitte abonniert uns. Wir haben den Abo-Link auch in der Beschreibung drin. Also bleibt dran und viel Spaß damit. So, Mr. Boyle, we are very excited to have you here today. And you're one of the journalists which are very close to Trump. And nobody interviews him as often as you do. That's the feeling we get. And for us and our German audience, it's super important to understand who Trump really is and what are his plans for Europe. And we are looking forward to see this to have this conversation with you. And I bet we're going to have a great time. And our time is limited, but we would like to cover lots of topics with you. So let's just start.
Okay, Mr. Boyle, we would like to jump into the interview with the 28th of February, which was a big thing in Germany. Breitbart News correspondent were in the Oval Office during that scandal that day between President Zelensky and President Trump. Was this incident staged, as repeatedly claimed in Germany, for example, by the expected new federal chancellor Friedrich Merz?
No, you're talking about the meeting between
Zelensky.
President Trump and President Zelensky.
Yeah.
No, I don't think it was staged. I mean, the plan going into the meeting was that they were going to sign the minerals agreement, and then Zelensky went off the rails during the meeting and started lecturing the vice president and the president. That didn't work out so well, and so then it ended badly, and they kicked Zelensky out of the White House, and but now things seem to kind of be back on track here. I think that what's going on is that Zelensky was testing the boundaries as to how serious President Trump is about ending the war in Ukraine. President Trump is serious about this. Like, I mean, he campaigned on it. It is a central part of his view is that this war is unnecessary and that it's costly, both in terms of lives and in financial cost and the cost of the infrastructure of Ukraine. It doesn't need to be happening in that it could be negotiated to an end very easily and quickly. And I think you're seeing the steps from President Trump in that regard right now. Both sides have apparently, at least as we're talking right now, agreed to the frameworks of a broad ceasefire, and that wouldn't happen if it wasn't for President Trump and him really leaning in on pushing towards ending the war. Do I think it was staged? No. Do I think that it was a moment, a particularly revelatory moment in that it showed the world that Zelensky maybe is the one that is standing in the way of peace? Yeah. I thought that it showed a lot in that regard. But look, there's a hunger here in the United States and I think worldwide for peace, right? And so people are tired of war. They're war weary, right? We've seen the wars that have consumed the planet, particularly the United States, for the last several decades, right? Obviously, we just got done with our longest war in U.S. history, which was the war in Afghanistan just a few years ago. We had Iraq in the last 20 years. It's just people they don't want this, right? And they want to see peace, especially when it doesn't make much sense for there to be a war there. And I think that the weakness of the Biden administration invited Putin to do what he did. And sure, Putin is the one who invaded Ukraine, right? He's the aggressor here, but at the same time, it was the mistakes in terms of Kamala Harris, the then vice president, going over and promising Ukraine NATO membership, which doesn't make much sense. Among other things, in terms of the weakness, and obviously it happened in the aftermath of the deadly withdrawal from Afghanistan. So the U.S. weakness was on under Biden was on the world stage and on display. So I think that what we're seeing now is a reset from President Trump. He is bringing back American strength, both economically, not just economically, but also militarily and diplomatically, to the world stage. And when America is strong and leads on the world stage, then peace reigns, right? But when America's weak, that's when chaos and war envelopes the planet. And so the president is extremely focused on peace. And I think that that Oval Office meeting was, emblematic of President Zelensky coming to the realization that this president is serious about this, right? I think he was testing the limits of how serious Trump is on this, and I think he now knows that President Trump is serious. So that's why the deal seems to be back on track, and why both sides are now moving towards a ceasefire and hopefully a broader peace agreement that ends this horrific war once and for all.
So you think this incident was rather good, or helping the process of peace, let's say, between Russia and not really bothering it, or be in a way?
Sure. I think that I think that this is, look, there was a lot of emotion and, blood, sweat, and tears and precious treasure that have been spent on every side of this thing, right? It's been a horrific war, right? It's been a lot deadlier and costlier than people realize, I think, in much of the Western world. Particularly here in the United States, because we're so far away, right? Like, obviously we have an ocean and a whole continent between us and Ukraine. You guys don't. You guys are closer, so you guys see it a little bit more clearly than we do. But the fact is that this thing has been very costly, and it's understandable that President Zelensky, is going to try to fight for the best position that he can for his people, just like President Putin is going to fight for the best position he can for his. And, Trump is the ultimate deal maker. I mean, that's his thing, right? Like, Trump is a deal maker. He believes that the two sides can get to the table. Look, I spoke to the president last week about this. We did a lengthy interview with him in the president's private dining room just off the Oval Office in the White House. And it was right after his phone call with President Zelensky, which came after he spoke to President Putin the day before. And frankly, those phone calls, he believes that a deal is within sights and within reach, and that this can be done, and it can be ended, and it can save American taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars, and it can save the Ukrainians, countless lives, and the Russians too. And then we can get back to focusing on, the major national priorities of the United States on the world stage. And frankly, the big picture here, always the big picture, has always been, since the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union, has always been that communism retreated to Beijing. Right? Like, so when communism fell in the Soviet Union, that doesn't mean Putin's a good guy. I think that President Trump recognizes, the issues with the Russians, but it's worth noting that of the last several presidents, the only one, and this includes Bush and Obama and Biden and Trump's first term, the last several presidents of the United States, there's only one administration where Putin hasn't engaged in in crossing over the border into another country, and that's Trump, right? Like, why did that happen? Because Trump is leading through economic and diplomatic and military strength on the world stage. It's peace through strength. It's an even stronger doctrine than Ronald Reagan had. Ronald Reagan talked about peace through strength in the 1980s. Trump has taken that to another level with economic and diplomatic strength as well as military.
Yeah, Mr. Boyle, all that sounds reasonable. But what do you think, or what do people in the US think about the fact that German officials, like I said, the forthcoming chancellor, spread such theories that it was staged?
I think that they look at these comments from European leaders and whatnot, and they just kind of scoff and laugh at it. Like, look, here's the big picture for the Europeans, okay? The European Union more broadly, Germany specifically, France, UK, etc., right? Like, do they want to be players in the world stage here? If so, they need to get with the times and ride with the United States and other major Western democratic nations like India, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, right? Like, and focus on where is the real threat here. The real threat is from Beijing. It's from China. That means that, it's time to recognize the Cold War was won decades ago. It's been 30 years, okay? It's been 30 years since the Cold War was won. It's time for the foreign policy establishment in the Western world, right? And we go through a little bit of this here in the United States too, right? Like our Democrat Party, obsessively focused with Putin, right? Like, and in our foreign policy establishment and deep state, you hear Trump talk about the deep state all the time. Like they're so focused on Putin in Russia. And again, we're not saying that the Russians are good guys, but they aren't the major problem. The focus and the priority needs to be on China. And I think that you're seeing the Trump administration's senior-most officials from the president on down through the vice president, the secretary of state, the secretary of the treasury, et cetera, recognize that.
So
they're orienting the focus here to Beijing. And so the hope is that the rest of the Western world and Europe will catch up with us and join us in that whole endeavor. We'll see if they do or not. But, again, I haven't talked to them specifically about Germany, but, I think that the hope is that Europe joins the United States and India and the rest of the world in so doing.
I think you're right that we probably underestimate the Chinese threat, I would say, to the Western democracies maybe. But still, this behavior of Trump and Vance seemed to many of here like a break with Europe, So do you think this kind of assessment is justified?
I don't think it's so much a break with Europe as an encouraging Europe to start doing the right things, whether it be on trade and economic policy, whether it be on national security policy. Look, our NATO partners need to pay up, right? Like, I mean, the United States has been footing the bill for NATO for generations, right? Like, and there are a handful of nations, I think Greece and maybe a couple others, that actually pay their full 3%. Right, like of their GDP, right? Like President Trump is right about this. Like, at what point do we stop footing the bill for everybody, right? Like, I mean, NATO was formed in the aftermath of World War II. Like, it's like, World War II was a century ago, right? Like, and so, or close to it. And so the fact is that it's time for the rest of the European nations to catch up with the U.S. And it's not just on that stuff, not just on the trade, economic, diplomatic stuff, military stuff, security, defense stuff, but it's also on basic human rights like freedom of speech, right? Like we're seeing, European nations, do some really troubling things with regard to freedom of speech and big tech. And I think that that alarms Washington and the United States, right? Like that plays into the autocratic hands in Beijing and whatnot. So they should be celebrating freedom of speech and openness of expression and championing that. What's the point of fighting for so-called democracy, right? Like, if they're not going to be democratic. Right. Like, and so that's why you heard that from the vice president when he went to Europe. I think you see this, in comments that he and other senior administration officials have made publicly and privately. It's not so much a break with Europe as we want Europe to be part of this broader, America First vision. When you'll regularly hear people say in the Trump White House, in fact, I talk to many of them all the time, talked to several last week, that America First does not mean America alone. But what it means is a focus on the U.S. national priorities. And our Constitution enshrines freedom of speech. We hope that the rest of the Western world will join us in celebrating those democratic values. And I think you are going to see the United States aggressively push for that. And so hopefully places like Germany and France and Italy and the UK and the rest of Western Europe joins with us, because I mean you guys are the closest to us culturally, right?
Yeah,
like and
absolutely.
in the world. And,
yeah.
So that's the hope.
Yeah.
So it's not true if German media or German officials say that this was a breakup with Europe. This is not true. This is not This is not President Trump's perspective.
I don't think so. So, and again, I haven't spoken directly. I don't want to speak for the president. I don't work for the administration. I work for the White House.
Well,
right? But
you can say what your impression is, right? Yeah.
Yeah, from my conversations with them. Right, from my conversations with them and from covering them and knowing these folks very closely. I know the president very well. I spent 3 hours with him last week, a week ago today, in the White House, mostly in the president's private dining room, but then later in the cabinet room. I know the vice president very well. I talk to him all the time. I know the president's family. I know the cabinet level officials. I've interviewed the secretaries of Treasury and state. I think that what they are trying to do is, there's been a vacuum in the previous administration of American leadership and our values and whatnot. And the Biden administration wasn't doing anything, right? Like, and they were just kind of there occupying space, right? Like they were, it was like worse than negative steps. It was just like they were sitting there doing nothing. And now we have a president that wants to do, aggressively. He's a chess player, right? Like he's out there moving the pieces around the board, and I think he will take help from anyone who will give it. And I think the hope is that the Europeans will join us and actually meet their NATO obligations, right? That's a huge thing, right? Like, in terms of their GDP, it shouldn't be 3 years from now or 5 years from now or 10 years from now. It should be today, right? Like every European nation should be meeting their NATO obligations today. Every NATO country should today, right? Like it's not acceptable that it keeps taking this long and that the United States taxpayer has to keep footing the bill for all these other countries. And then in addition to that, again, the free speech thing is a big deal, right? Like the United States is a huge believer in a freedom of speech. It is why we are a free people. It is why we are the power that we are. Is the basic values that are enshrined in our Bill of Rights and our Constitution, right? Like, and frankly, European nations need to start reflecting that stuff. And I think that they are going to fight for that. But at the same time, I think they view European nations as cultural allies in these questions, and they just think that the folks in Europe maybe went a little bit too far in supporting these globalist leftist efforts on things like migration and climate and so on and so forth. Maybe there needs to be a little bit of a course correction there in Brussels and across Western Europe.
To be honest, it's really hard to imagine that Trump and, for example, the new Chancellor Merz, if he's assigned, let's see, in a couple of months, that they get along very well. So do you feel like Trump is still stretching out his hands towards Germany, towards Europe, or is it more like he's now just waiting and see if they come to him and start the relationships?
Yeah, Trump's an inherent deal maker, right? Like he loves working with people, even if they disagree with him, right? Like you will see him work with folks, from across political, ideological, national perspectives. I mean, it's just, it's amazing to watch, right? Like, so I wouldn't count anything out. Like, by the way, one of the warmest meetings we saw from President Trump so far, or two of the warmest meetings, were with the British Prime Minister, who's a Labour Party guy, right? Like Keir Starmer, right? Like in the Emmanuel Macron, who's kind of a centrist establishmentarian type guy from France. Right. Like, so it's not just nationalist leaders that President Trump can get along with. He is a master negotiator and a deal maker at heart. And so I think that he will try to find common ground with anyone who's willing to work with him. And I think that, it kind of remains to be seen there. And I hope that they have a state visit at some point and communicate, because I bet there is a lot of things they can work together on, particularly on energy, particularly on economic deals, and so on and so forth. But again, the big picture is, the rest of the world's been freeloading off the United States for too long when it comes to trade, when it comes to defense, when it comes to security, when it comes to diplomacy. And the United States is resetting that balance at this point with President Trump back in the White House. And I think it's only fair. Like, for instance, I know the rest of the world's freaking out about these tariffs, these reciprocal tariffs. Well, how is it that, if a European car maker makes a car and ships it to the United States, we only charge them 2.5% tariff on that, and then a U.S. car maker makes a car and ships it to Europe, and European country charges 10%. How is that fair? It should either be both 2.5%, both 10%, or both 0%, right? But it's not fair trade. There's no such thing as free trade. Free trade's a make-believe concept, all right? But there is fair trade. And the tariffs should be reciprocal, back and forth, right? And so, if a certain country is going to charge a certain percentage, let's say percentage X for, product A, right? Then the other country should be able to charge this exact same percentage X for product A back the other way. Right. And if that's how it's going to be, that's how it should be. But it's a rebalancing of the equation in the relationship. But I think that, again, at the end of the day, the United States looks at Europe like cultural allies in this broader equation, in hopes that Europe drops the nonsense with regard to the migration and the climate nonsense and the other left-wing nonsense, and starts focusing in on the core values that should unite us as peoples, rather than split us.
Mr. Boyle, please, you have conducted several interviews with President Trump and also with J.D. Vance, as far as I know. And what is your personal impression of them as humans, and of course as politicians, please?
Yeah, so we'll start with President Trump. President Trump is, first off, he's a business guy. He's not really a politician. He's new to the political world. He's still new, even 8 years into this, or a little over that now, right? Probably like 10 years. If you go back to when he first really started entering the political arena, he's still learning. Right. And I think he knows a lot more now than he did in the first term. And I think you see him more effective now because of that, because he knows how things operate. But Trump is somebody who's, applies common sense, right? He's not somebody who is so ideologically committed to one position or another position or anything like that. And we've seen that in the past from U.S. leaders on both sides of the political aisle, both Republicans and Democrats, where they dig themselves into a corner on a certain issue. Trump isn't hindered by that, right? He just goes where he thinks the common sense is. And I think you see the result of that in his policy. He's also a really fun person, right? For whatever it's worth, right? His sense of humor is unrivaled, right? I always find myself, whenever I'm talking to him, amazed and laughing at whatever he's got going on. And he is very in touch.
Is he good at telling jokes?
He knows he loves his Diet Coke, right? He drinks Diet Coke. Then I would also say, when you interview Trump, especially if it's not on camera, right? Yeah. So if it's a print interview, right? And he knows there's not going to be broadcast, right, of it. It's a print interview, and that's usually how I'll interview President Trump, is in a print interview. This one we did in the White House last week was a print interview, and there were 2 other Breitbart journalists there with me, our editor-in-chief, Alex Marlowe, our White House correspondent, Nick Gilbertson. But usually we'll do these print interviews. I've interviewed him on camera before. I've interviewed him on radio before as well. But when we do the print interview, it's kind of really fascinating, because it's very much a two-way street conversation. It's not really an interview. It's not like you sit down and ask him a question and then he answers question, and then you ask him another question. It's very much a free-flowing, wide open conversation where he kind of just tells you what's on his mind, right? Like, and then you kind of try to guide the conversation in one way or another, right? Like, and try to see where things go. This last conversation we were with him last week, we talked to him about a whole ton of different things, right? Like he had some other business leaders, partners of his in the room as well. So he's telling us stories of the olden days before he got into politics, when he first started doing like public speaking appearances back in like the 80s and 90s and stuff. And then, we talked a little bit about an opera singer he was telling us about. And then we ended up, I think we talked, we oftentimes talk about golf. He's a huge golf fan. Follows professional golf very much so. I don't think we talked much about golf on this interview at all, but then he's also very focused on the judicial system here in the United States, what we have seen with what he's gone through personally over the last several years, and then to what we're seeing now happen with his agenda, right? Like several of these judges are totally out of control and trying to dictate to the administration how federal policy is supposed to be executed or implemented or decided. And that's not how our Constitution is structured. And so he was very focused on that. But then beyond that, we talked a little bit about Ukraine and Russia, because, again, like I mentioned, he had just got off the phone earlier that afternoon with President Zelensky, and a little bit about China as well, and also about the opposition and how he views the Democrat Party. And frankly, what we're seeing right now from the Democrat Party is they are totally a mess, right? Like the Democrat Party here in the United States is splintered and broken.
You don't hear so much in Germany, by the way. It's not a big topic.
You won't. The question is will they be able to claw their way back in these upcoming midterm elections? And there's some signs out there that they might, right? Like, so it's a storyline that we're tracking, right? Like there's special elections going on right now in the U.S. To fill vacancies and whatnot. And Democrats have frankly overperformed in some of them, right? There was a state Senate seat in Pennsylvania just yesterday. The Democrats won. It's the first time in 163 years, I think, that the Democrats won that seat. So there are some positive signs for them, but there are also some really negative signs. They don't really have a national leader. They don't have a message. They don't know what they stand for. So we talked to the president about that a little bit. And now to your second part of your question about Vance.
Yes,
Vance is very a working class guy. He is the story Hillbilly Elegy. I know he embraces the title Hillbilly, right? Like he very much does. He comes from the most ardent circumstances growing up, right? His mother was on drugs. He had a single mother family. His grandmother
many siblings, right?
What?
He had some siblings are like a big family, right? Or
yeah, exactly. And he grew up in basically working poor, abject poverty, right? Like, and he pulled himself out, right? Like he worked hard in school. He got to Yale, and that's where he met the love of his life, the second lady of the United States, Usha Vance, and they're both going to Greenland together later this week, which is a real fascinating story. What's happening there too, But I think that J.D. Vance has never forgotten where he came from. And he views himself as a seat at the table in the room for those working class people that have been forgotten here in the United States. That's the story of Trump, by the way. Trump is their voice, and J.D. Vance is even more so. And I think that there's a reason why you see a lot of globalist interests out there dislike J.D. Vance, but like, again, if you go, I know everybody freaked out when he went to Europe and his, first couple of weeks as vice president, and he came out and he criticized some things. Please point me to where he's wrong, right? Like, what did he say that was inaccurate? Is there anything?
Yeah, good
Right?
question.
Like, I think,
By the way, that was on our list also.
That's a good question, and we would like to ask, what do you think? Mr. Vance in Munich, he complained about the situation in Europe, that he has big concerns what he sees. Do you think that Mr. Trump and Mr. Vance will just continue to observe the situation and to warn, or do you think they will take action to perhaps better the situation in Europe, if it's possible for them?
I don't know what actions they would take specifically, but I do think that they will continue to call it out, right? Like, so when they're wrong, when they think there's a wrong being done, they're going to use their voices. That's the beauty of the First Amendment in the United States, right? We have freedom of speech here in America, and that applies to the president, that applies to the vice president, that applies to every member of Congress, that applies to every member of the media, and every member of every American citizen has it, right? Like, and so the hope is that the rest of the world will also use those, use and implement those values, right? Like, so what we've seen is this slow creep away from freedom of speech in Europe. And that needs to change, right? Like, so hopefully the German government will heed their warnings and actually do take some historic steps away from, big tech censorship and whatnot. I know this is a huge thing that you see with the American tech companies dealing with the Europeans. Frankly, the Europe's starting to look a lot more like China when it comes to freedom of speech and expression than it is the United States. And that needs to change, right? Like, so I think you will see them use their voices and step up and use their power now, as for like whatever specific actions, I don't know what actions they may or may not take. But I do think that they will use the tools of diplomacy, including especially their voices, to call it out. And I think, again, I challenge anyone. I know that it maybe rubbed people the wrong way because it, stepped into their little hidey holes in their, their safe spaces. But maybe challenge people where they were. But the fact is that point me to one thing he said that was inaccurate. It's not. And by the way, I would also point you to the speech he gave in Paris, the vice president, where a lot of those world leaders were there at that AI summit, the artificial intelligence summit. I think Modi was there, and like a whole ton of others were in the audience. And I think that the vice president's speech there, I don't know if he used the words China in that speech or not, but he was talking a lot about China in that speech. And I would highly recommend people watch that speech. But I think that, again, I challenge anyone to point to anything that he said that's wrong.
By the way,
they can.
What do you think? What does Vance and what does Trump think about the AfD?
I've not spoken to them particularly about that at that level of a local.
That would be interesting to know for our audience, I think.
Yeah, if I get the chance, I'll ask. I mean, I'd love
definitely.
So many things we can ask about in these interviews, But I do think that they, generally speaking, are encouraged by conservative, economic nationalist type movements worldwide, right? Like, we are seeing a rise worldwide of like-minded people winning or getting close to winning major elections in a number of countries worldwide, whether it's in South America, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in, everywhere worldwide. We're seeing encouraging things where the radical globalist left is being rejected, right? Their failed visions on climate and immigration, and terror and national security and economically are being rejected by voters the planet over. Right. Like, and so the left is losing. Right. Like, but we're, this is a big thing that we're fighting right now here in the United States. There's this whole Signal Gate thing over the apps that the people are talking about and communicating on. The fact is that people need to recognize that we are in a war for what kind of a country and what kind of a world we want to have. Right. Like, there are competing worldviews at war with each other. And, everybody on either side needs to recognize there is a war, right? Like, and wake the hell up, right? Like, and I think they are, right? Like, and so slowly but surely, and again, November the 5th, when President Trump won and Republicans shocked and won both the House and the Senate, was a big moment and a big thing. But I don't think they won the war that day. I think that they won a chance to win the war here in the United States, but also worldwide. We are seeing some promising stuff worldwide. And so, but I haven't talked to them specifically about German politics.
Yeah.
So
But do you think it might be possible that Mr. Trump one day takes a conversation with AfD leader Mrs. Alice Weidel, like Elon Musk, perhaps not on space, on X, but in general?
Golfing together in Germany,
Trump
maybe.
Very likely to. He's somebody who wants to talk to everybody. Right. Like, so when he tries, right. Like, so, I mean, you saw this in his first term where he was talking to again, these are whether he agrees with people or disagrees with people or whatever. But I would say that, I would say probably. So
you've been with Trump, I think, even before his first presidency, right? So you know him very well.
I got to know him first back in like 2013, 2014.
Okay, good. Perfect. So I think you have a great picture then of him and his first presidency and then the second one. And where do you see where's the difference now? Does he behave differently now? Maybe also on a personal level in the White House, but also maybe on the in his whole policy. Did it change? What's your perspective on that?
So I think that President Trump is still President Trump, right? He hasn't changed, right? Like, so he's still the same guy he's always been. He's there fighting for the things that we talked about.
Well, the critics was in the beginning that he was too weak or not pushing too much.
Well, so the big difference between the two terms is there's two major differences, right? The first is that Trump is more experienced, right? Like, so I think that Trump understands things a little bit more. I've talked to him about this. I remember I was with him at his golf course in Bedminster doing another one of these interviews back in 2021. So it was in the immediate aftermath of his first term. And it was the night before the Abbey Gate bombing, by the way, and in Afghanistan during the deadly withdrawal that Joe Biden got 13 of our servicemen and women killed by the way that he handled himself there. But anyway, and Trump was already calling it the most embarrassing moment in the history of our country, even before that. And then it got even worse. But the point is that I remember being with him there and we talked about it then. And he had talked to me a little bit about this, is that, when he first got to Washington in 2017, after he won the 2016 election, he was, he knew he had one mission, which was run the country. The second mission that he didn't know he had, which was, became apparent later, he said, was that he has to survive, right? Like, in that, they were coming after him, right? They were coming after him. They tried to impeach him twice, right? We saw what they did with COVID, and they weaponized politically the lockdowns. We saw what they did with the impeachment, the deep state, the media, the establishment media, not us, right? Like, in so many other different places. And then later in his post-presidency, they literally shot the guy, right? Like, he literally survived the gunshot.
So did it change him?
The point is that they've been coming after him from the get-go because of what he stands for and because of what he represents. And I think that, that wasn't apparent to him, I think, at first in the first term. And now I think it is. And then secondly, so that's the first thing. So he's more experienced and understands things a little bit more. And he hadn't really been to Washington that much, right? He'd occasionally go in for a day, but then he would never really stay overnight in DC until he was president in 2017. Now, now he understands the ways of Washington better. But the second big thing that's different from the first term is that there are a lot of people that can work throughout the federal government that are competent enough, that have the resumes and the experience to staff out a federal government that are that have grown up in this American First Republican Party. Remember, Trump beat 16 other Republicans first in 2016 in the primaries before he won the general election. And those Republicans had very different worldviews than President Trump. And the staffers who had the resumes necessary to work in key political appointed positions throughout the federal government kind of fit more with the other way of, the older way of doing things in the Republican Party. I would, a president has to appoint at any given moment anywhere from 4,000 to 5,000 political appointees across the federal government. That's not the generic career federal workforce. I'm talking about political appointed positions. And so some of those are Senate confirmed, some of them are not. The difference is this time, I think you see there are a lot of people and you see it in the cabinet, right? Like, I mean, look at the cabinet, right? Like, it's so much stronger and better and more impressive than the first time. Again, not to knock the cabinet in the first term or the White House staff, etc. But the fact is that you see a much more experienced and, in the first term, you could probably fit the people that had the resume necessary to work in senior political appointed positions in the federal government in the cabin of Trump's plane, right? Like, this time around, you have thousands ready to go. And there are people, like, for instance, look at Carolyn Leavitt, the White House press secretary. She's 27 years old. 8 years ago, she was just out of high school, right? Like, and so now she has grown up in a Republican Party entirely dominated by President Trump and his America First worldview. That was not the case with a number of the people that staffed out the first term. So I think that the more experience from Trump, along with the depth and experience of the people that can work throughout the government, is making the second term, a lot more efficient and effective and competent than the first term. Again, not to knock the first term. I think he did pretty good. All things better than the first term. Yeah. But the second term, even stronger for those reasons.
What will be the outcome of the second term in your perspective? From your perspective, how will President Trump leave the country after 4 years? How will the U.S. look like then?
Well, the big question is can he get the agenda done, right? Like,
yes,
he's
of course,
done a lot already, right? But he's got a lot to do still, right? Like, so we're tracking what's going on in Congress. Are they going to be able to pass the tax relief package and so on and so forth? If he's able to get the agenda done and the Republicans recognize that they're at war with this globalist, leftist, psychopathic movement that we see, then frankly, the President Trump could be, and this is yet remains to be seen, and a big test will be the upcoming midterm elections in 2026. But President Trump could be to Republicans what Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s was to Democrats, right? In 1932, for FDR won the presidency, and in 1934, Democrats expanded majorities in both the House and the U.S. Senate. There's only one other time in modern history where this has happened, where a president's party has actually added seats in the aftermath of their, in their first midterms, and that is the post 9/11 election, after George W. Bush, and I think that was a reaction to 9/11, right? Like, and so this has the opportunity to be very much a political realignment in America. Where Black voters, Hispanic voters, women, young voters, etc., and across demographics, especially working class folks, really leave the Democrat Party and join the Republican Party under President Trump. But it all comes down to, do the Republicans deliver? And then then beyond the midterm elections going into 2028, does and one would think that J.D. Vance, the sitting vice president, is probably the leading candidate for that situation. Is he able to take the torch, using an inherently European analogy here, right? Like, take the torch of like the Olympic runner from President Trump and carry it from there moving forward and take this movement beyond where it is now into the future. So there are a lot of challenges ahead. And again, this is not over, right? Like, it's not like the whole thing ended on November 5th and that everybody gets the coast, right? Like, and I'm a little worried that some of them think that it's time to, they won and they don't have to do anything anymore. I don't think that's a healthy way of looking at things. But I think that as long as they meet the moment and they deliver on these challenges and they power through, then they will carry we will be able to see that torch carried forward and the political realignment completed in American politics.
So there's more than just changing the politics in the 4 years. So do you think it's like they even desire a cultural revolution, maybe?
Is a cultural revolution necessary?
Cultural revolution. That's a very Maoist term, but
Yeah.
But yeah, no, look, I think that you're seeing the focus on cultural issues as well, right? Like, so obviously you see them big time focus on the transgender insanity,
Yeah.
right? Like, by the way, from what I understand, the Europeans are actually more reasonable on this than the United States, right? Like, I don't think that you guys have this problem like we do here.
Well, it's maybe a little just a perspective.
Not as bad.
Well, yeah.
I mean, here it's just totally psychopathic, right? Like, and so so hopefully they're able to do that. But look, at the end of the day, it's the broader, bigger agenda, and they have a historic opportunity in front of them. The question is, will they deliver or will they squander it? And so, they have a mandate. The question is, will they do it? And it's not just on Trump, but Trump is a big part of this, obviously, right? Like, but it's on the Republicans on Capitol Hill and whatnot. They have to recognize this and understand it and fight for it. So there is the chance at a true political realignment and a real working class party, right? Like a real working class party. That's what everything has to be about. Do they stand for the American worker? Are they the voice of the average forgotten man and woman in this country, or are they not? Right? Like, are they going to do the special interest stuff and whatever the Chinese want and this, that, and the other thing? I don't know. So like, that's the story I'm tracking. I'm watching very closely, and we'll see what they decide in the end. Either way, it's going to be fascinating to watch, I think. So
yes,
much more exciting. Boring Biden administration, right?
Yeah. Yes, indeed. It needs the whole party, as you just mentioned, but because is it possible just from the government, just by administrative measures, to change the whole country? I mean, he is not only fighting the psychopathic left, as you called it, he's also fighting as the whole establishment, isn't he?
Yeah, there are forces inside the Republican Party who don't want to change the party. They want to go back to the good old days of Paul Ryan and Mitt Romney and fiscal cliffs and throwing grandma off the cliff and cutting Social Security, right? Like, and so there are Republicans like that, and there are people in the we talked a little bit about the judiciary, right? Like, in the judges. I mean, that's a major fight as well. So but yeah, no, it's not just a fight with the Democrats. This is a fight with the Republicans as well, and frankly with the establishment media, right? Like, the establishment media.
That's an interesting point. We're going to go back to that later.
Organ of this globalist failure, right? Like, and so there are promising signs from the White House. They've taken a lot of great steps, right? Like with the new media seat. I was there for the first day in the White House briefing room for their first new media seat day. But there's a lot more change that needs to happen, and so we'll see if they do that stuff or not, or if they just revert back to the olden ways. I don't know. So we'll see.
All right. Well, do you think we're going to continue here? Well, okay. Well, this is also an interesting topic we're going to cover yet. I hope you can spare a few more minutes, because I think this is a very interesting conversation going on. So, well, the German media, talking about established media, they report that according to some U.S. polling institutes, Trump has lost up to 8% since the election. And his approval rating is falling down below 50%. I don't know if that's true, or what do you think? Is that true?
Depends on what polls you look at, right? Like, yeah. So there was a CNN story yesterday where Harry Enton, who's CNN's polling data guy, was all over CNN talking about how the numbers of people who believe that the United States is on the right track versus the wrong track, right? Like, the number that believe that the U.S. is on the right track is at like record highs across different pollsters, right? So it just depends. And I think that, what we've seen in 2016 and again in 2024, and frankly in the midterm elections in between, and in the 2020 election is that the polls are dead wrong a lot, right? Like, so just be careful reading polls. I think there's a lot of information you can glean from polling, right? Like, and it's an art, not a science, right? Like, or it's a little bit of both, maybe. But just you gotta pop open the hood and look at the raw numbers that they're collecting. You gotta figure out their methodology. You gotta figure out who they're sampling, are they oversampling this group or that group or whatever. There's, just be careful trusting the top line numbers of any polling. And that goes across the board for any pollster. But if there are things you can learn. You just got to be careful with this stuff. But again, like I said, CNN literally did a thing yesterday that, we're at record level numbers, at least in a modern polling era, with regard to right track, wrong track. And that's because of Trump, right? Like, so, and I think that Trump's popularity is up in some of those surveys, right? Like, so I think that, it depends on which polls you're looking.
So you don't think there is a problem by now for Trump? For example, U.S. political scientist Jack Goldstone says that he has disappointed in a certain way some of his voters concerning solving the problems of high prices and of mass immigration, and his action do not really help in these issues. So some people start to turn away from Trump. But this analysis by Mr. Goldstone isn't correct from your perspective?
Oh, I've never heard of this guy before.
No.
I haven't read it.
So it doesn't,
right? Like, so I can't address that directly, but I will say I think that if you look at the immigration enforcement numbers, we went from record high numbers of people coming across the border every month during the Biden presidency to now basically nobody coming across the border during the Trump presidency. So the inflow of new people across the border illegally or through questionable legality has dropped to basically nothing because of a new president. You heard the president use a line to that effect in his joint address to Congress just a few weeks ago, where he said, we didn't need a new piece of legislation. All we needed was a new president. Well, that's true, right? Like, and then you are seeing the ongoing removal efforts of criminals and other people with, questionable backgrounds right now from the United States that were brought in under Biden. That's an ongoing thing, and that's a lot more complicated than just stopping the flow of new ones. But so I think the immigration stuff is actually maybe the brightest spot so far this administration in terms of the numbers. The numbers are the proof, right? Like, now as for the economy, egg prices are down now, right? Like, so this was a major thing a few weeks ago where egg prices were up because, we're dealing with the avian bird flu in addition to the inflation stuff that was both problems left over from Biden. But so egg prices were hit the hardest. Well, egg prices are now lower than when Donald Trump took office, right? Gas prices are down. There's home prices are down and people are buying homes, right? Like, and whatnot. So we're 2 months into this thing, right? Like a little over 2 months and a week, right? Like if that. And so, it's what, March 20 something, right? Like, so, President Trump was sworn in on January 20th. You were already seeing positive economic signs. There are trillions of dollars of investment coming back into the United States in terms of companies either relocating entirely to the United States from elsewhere around the world, or coming back after they left other places, or deciding to manufacture things here versus other places. These are things like car plants and stuff, right? I think like Hyundai and Honda both announced major efforts to build automobiles here in the United States rather than in other places, or like Mexico. You're seeing, other major companies do the same thing. That takes a little bit of time for those things, economic impact for that stuff to really play out. But I think that there's a lot of positive signs so far. And you're already seeing also the consumer, the CPI and PPI numbers, that's Consumer Price Index and Producer Price Index numbers, seem to be stabilizing. So you're already seeing some of the inflation numbers turning around under Trump just 2 months in. This is, so I don't know if I buy the analysis from this guy I've never heard of in terms of polling numbers, and I don't even know what polls he's talking about, right? Like, so I can't help you there. Yeah. But what I can do is I can tell you that I think that you are seeing, you know, very positive steps already from the Trump administration on both of those fronts, the economy and the immigration front.
So talking about the immigration problem, in the first term, the wall to the Mexican border was a big issue, or let's say big topic. What's now happening to it?
Well, yeah,
we don't hear anything about the wall now.
Yeah, it seems like nobody's even fighting the building of a wall anymore because they recognize how popular it is, right? Like, and so, you know, hey, look, the Chinese built a wall back in the day, right? There's a Great Wall of China. You guys had a wall in Berlin, right? Like
we had,
walls work, right? Like we know that, right? Like walls work.
Well, that was a different wall, but yeah.
A wall's a wall, right? Like it stops people, it stops stuff, right? Like, and so President Trump was right about this in 2016. He's right about it now. And the Democrats have seemed to have dropped their opposition to the idea of the necessity of a wall. Then now the Overton window has moved to whether or not, you know, it's not even so much whether or not the violent criminals from like Tren de Aragua, which is a Venezuelan gang, or other, you know, gangs and criminals and whatnot are removed from the country. It's now just a question of like how they're removed from the country, right? Like, and so that's the battleground on which we're fighting politically here in the United States. Sure, there are some Democrats that are still of the belief that we should open the border. In fact, probably a lot of them, that we should open the border to anyone and everyone, including those who want to murder college girls, like, you know, they did during the Biden administration, right? Like poor Lake Riley, right? But there was one of the key moments at the very end of the Biden presidency, and this was the first bill that President Trump signed into law when he came to office, was the Lake and Riley Act. And a number of Democrats in the U.S. Senate voted for that, right? Like, so there are some promising signs, but the Democrats still have a lot of soul searching and, you know, I don't know, maybe they have to go like do some therapy sessions and, you know, talk to their psychiatrists and maybe figure out how do they come around on supporting American sovereignty when it comes to immigration. Now, immigration is an economic issue too. And I think that perhaps more, maybe even more importantly than the the sovereignty and the national security and the public safety questions with regard to immigration are important. Don't get me wrong, but economic question as well. If you increase the labor supply, you decrease the demand for labor. What happens when you decrease the demand for labor? You increase you decrease wages and you increase unemployment. So what we were seeing in the Biden administration was this artificial inflation of artificial inflammation of the number of people in the country. So it was hampering wage growth and it was keeping unemployment higher than it should have been. I think that you are going to see, as these folks are removed from the country, and you are seeing Tom Homan and Stephen Miller and Kristi Noem, the great folks in the immigration enforcement community here in the United States and the Trump administration aggressively working on doing this. As they're removed from the country, the people that are here illegally, and sent home where they belong, where they can go home. You know, and then as that happens, you're going to see wages rise, and it's already kind of happening, right? Like, and so wages are rising, unemployment keeps falling, right? Like, so all of this stuff is interconnected. And President Trump deeply understands that, as do the people around him. And so, you know, it's certainly a fascinating story to watch.
Mr. Boyle, our next question on our list would have been about tariffs, but you have talked about tariffs just before. So I would instead like to ask you, what is your personal impression about Mr. Trump? How is he reacting on critique? I mean, it seems he's very harsh and sometimes, but you know him personally. Is he somebody who can take critique from a person like you?
Sure. Like, by the way, I've done it before in the past, many times, right? Like, and, you know, just I don't work for him, right? Like, I'll call him out if I think he's wrong. But he takes it well, right? Like, it's just, you better have your collective, you know what, together if you're gonna call him out, right? Like, you better have, you know, your facts straight, and you better have it sorted out. And I think that he takes it well and he listens, right? Like, one of the best qualities about President Trump, I think, that that everybody underrates, you know, they overlook this about him. He's a excellent listener, right? Excellent listener, right? Like in fact, he builds in channels into his team to create a feedback, right? Like, to be able to listen. So if you look at across his administration, it may look like there are clashes between different people. There are, right? Like, there are different worldviews between several of his senior advisors, you know, whether it's certain cabinet officials or other advisors, etc. I think that that's by design, right? Because he wants to hear the differing viewpoints and then kind of determine what the best one is. One of the biggest stories you saw during this administration was this supposed cabinet meeting that was off camera, right? Not on television. Where supposedly Marco Rubio and Elon Musk were fighting with each other, right? The New York Times had this big article about it. The administration denied it, but whatever. So the fact is that if the way it happened in the New York Times story is true, and I don't know, I wasn't in the room for that, so I don't know, and I know the administration says one thing, the New York Times says another. It doesn't matter. But the point is that everybody's doing their job, right? Elon Musk has his charge. Marco Rubio has his charge, right, which is run the State Department and influence things worldwide, right, on behalf of the United States. And Elon Musk's charge is cut government waste and spending and waste, fraud, and abuse. So that you know, those sometimes those things may conflict with each other. So that they kind of have their little disagreement. They argue it out in front of the president, and the president, who's the boss and the whole thing, he's the chief executive for the nation, deconflicts and says, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do this instead of that. That's how it's supposed to work, right? Like, so, you know, I mean, what's wrong with that, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with that. So I just think that, you know, the hyperventilation from the Trump derangement syndrome people is overblown. And, you know, it's we got to get focused here, right? Like, it's agenda time, right? Like, and so we'll see where it goes from here.
Okay, but if he's like you have described it, why seems he to be so unforgiven sometimes when critics, when he's confronted with critic, like in press conferences, there he sometimes reacts very unforgiving. How does this fit together?
Trump, the ultimate TV guy, right? Like, so this Trump put on a show for you, right? Like, but the point is that he totally listens to everybody out there. He takes in all the different viewpoints, and then he makes the ultimate best decision, right? So it's like, I see all these people upset about, like, you know, there's a lot of people out there that are very, like I mentioned earlier in the interview, very skeptical of war, right? Like, and that's a huge thing here in the United States, and it's a big part of why Trump won both times, I think. But the fact is that, you know, so there'll be all these people out there that are criticizing this thing or that thing that this advisor or that advisor is doing. At the end of the day, it's Donald Trump who makes the decision, right? He takes all the information from all the different sides and then makes his ultimate decision, right? So like what you're seeing right now with regard to U.S. action against the Houthis in Yemen, right? Like, that is President Trump made a decision. He decided to do that. And he went forward with it, right? Like, so the idea that Trump can be manipulated by anybody, no. Like, he is Trump. He is Donald Trump. He's the strongest, fiercest, most independent thinker that I've ever met. And he will he listens to all sides. He hears all the evidence, and then he goes with what he thinks is the best decision, right? Like, it's that simple, right? Like, and that's what a chief executive or commander in chief, etc., that's what they're supposed to do. Right? Like, and so it's refreshing to see somebody who can do that instead of falling down on his bicycle, right? Like, you know, like the former president, okay? Like, the former president couldn't even walk. He was shaking hands with ghosts on his way out of the office. With ghosts, right? Like, he walked off the woods like children were born, right? Like, the fact is that Donald Trump actually is leading And that's a refreshing thing, I think, for a lot of Americans, and it's why you're seeing the right track number go, through.
As a journalist yourself, what's your take on Trump's actions against, let's say, media he disagrees with? Let's say, like the AP's recent expulsion. You know, like
I'm a journalist at heart, right? Like I want the industry of American journalism to succeed. The problem is it's a lot deeper than the way they cover Trump. Okay, there's a lot of problems. They go back a long time in this industry and in this country, and it all comes from this objectivity lie that they started back in the mid 20th century, where they all tried to falsely lie and claim they're objective and so on and so forth. The fact is that they deserve it, right? Like okay. I mean, look.
So it's a fight back.
They all get it wrong. And they've dug their own graves. Okay, like these people across the establishment media have dug their own graves, and it's up to
they're not going to be any peace talks, right?
All the criticism they're getting and more, and frankly, I think they should do even more. Now, look, at the end of the day, what I like to see. An actual legitimate journalistic organization, not the White House Correspondents Association, but something like it, right? Like that actually does stand up for press freedom, access, and the beliefs that we're talking about here. Represent and make the decisions on for the media organizations. Yeah, I don't like the White House making the decision of who gets access and who doesn't. I don't like that politicians making that decision. But for now, because the White House Correspondents Association is so decrepit and corrupt, this is the best we've got, right? Like, so hopefully something will emerge and there will be some major reforms. And there are some promising things happening at certain publications. For instance, the guy that is running the Washington Post now at the, which is owned by Jeff Bezos, one of the richest people on planet Earth, right? Like, this guy, Will Lewis, seems to be doing some really exciting things over there, right? Like, so I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing there. But the problem is what we're seeing at a place like CNN or the New York Times or NBC or MSNBC and a lot of the different television networks, they're going the wrong way, right? Like, and so none of them learned the right lessons for what they did wrong in the last several elections. And the media industry is in turmoil, and you wonder why everybody's getting laid off, right? And why they're all financially hurting. Why is that happening? Because there are major systemic flaws in the media institutions here in the United States. And all of it stems back to those basic things like I was talking about there with the objectivity lie. But the question is, will we see real reforms? Maybe, maybe not. But if they don't reform themselves, and something will take its place, and, I'd argue Breitbart is one of those places that's stepping up into the void. So...
Yes, good keyword. And in the end, we would like to ask you a question about Breitbart. Could you please give us your point of view on Breitbart? Because in Germany, it's not very good, not very well known. And if people know it, then they have heard, that's a right-wing, extremist, fake news factory, Trump propaganda platform for Trump. Please, what is Breitbart? What is the truth about Breitbart, and what is its position in the U.S. today?
Yeah, so we are a new media company, right? Like we are a journalistic operation, right? Like we cover the news, right? Like, so we are not a political operation, right? Like, so we don't work for any politician or any candidate or any party or anything like that, right? Like, so we cover the news as we see it. We were founded in 2007 by our founder, Andrew Breitbart. What is that? Almost 20 years ago. Right. So we're one of the older new media companies out there. So we have a lot of experience. We have dozens of journalists based all around the United States and worldwide as well. We have journalists based in Europe. We have journalists throughout the world, in Mexico, Canada, all across the United States, as I mentioned. Our company headquarters in Los Angeles. We have a huge bureau in Washington. I run our Washington bureau, right? Like in Washington, D.C. In our national political coverage. We cover the news, right? Like, so with the heavy focus on U.S. politics, obviously, but cultural stuff and world affairs as well. I'd argue that the way we do things differently than a lot of other, major media outlets in the West is that, or at least here in the United States, we're a lot closer to like a British newspaper, right? Like in that we're open about what it is that we believe. So when you hear people say, "Oh, right wing," well, yeah, we're right wing, right? Like we're on the conservative side, right? Like if you look at, I think that if you stop lying to people about claiming that you are objective or a robot and that you can make decisions, objectively, you can't. We're people, right? Like, so we might as well be honest with our audience about what it is that we believe, and then you can start to build trust that way. And I think that more and more people are open to that way of thinking. That is what Andrew Breitbart always believed. In fact, that's the way the British press works, right? Like, so, I would imagine a lot of European press, right? Like across the continent, very similar, and that you just be open about it, right? Like if you're on the left, fine. If you're on the right, fine, right? Like just be honest with your audience about it. And then, because every decision we make, from who we interview to who we don't, to what we cover to what we don't, to what facts we include to which ones we don't, has the opportunity for the insertion of bias, intended or not. And frankly, there's a lot of decent people that work across the establishment media outlets here that I've regularly criticized in the United States. That they're not bad people. They're not doing it out of ill intent or something, right? Like, or being malevolent here or something, right? Like I think some of them are, but like for the most part, this is just an institutional flaw where that mistrust. If you ask people if it's in the Washington Post or the New York Times, do you believe it to be true? The vast majority of Americans will say no.
Yeah.
And speaking of polls, right? Like, so the point is that so we approach things differently. We break a lot of big stories, right? Like we've been there through a lot of these different major political moments here in the United States, from the rise of Trump in 2016, dating back even before that. Different things that were happening in American politics, particularly on the right, but also on the left. And then other major things around the world. We do a lot of world coverage of China in particular, of Europe, etc. So, we have a great team of journalists. We're growing, we're building, we're getting stronger, and as compared with our competitors, right? Like across the establishment media, and they're all in trouble. So we feel good about where we're at. I would argue we are the best read publication in the Trump White House and across the American political right, the American political conservative movement here in the United States.
And that you are very close to President Trump. He calls him my Matty. Very nice, of course. But is that appropriate for a journalist? What's your point of view?
I don't see why. Look, we're people, right? Like, so you know what I mean? Like I see. I've got friends and people that I like and don't like, etc., across the political world. And by the way, some of my best friends work on the other side. They work on the left, right? Like, so I know plenty of people across the political world. So
thanks.
All right. Thank you very much for your time. It was a
very
pleasure.
good, very interesting.
Yeah, good insights, and maybe you can help us out to interview Trump one day.
Maybe.
Yes.
Maybe. Good luck.
For the German news outlet. Yeah. All right.
All the best, and thank you very much indeed, sir.